Hello, everyone. I hope that you are doing well and that you're staying safe out there. This is Jake Rawls, and for this lesson, a few quick notes before we get started. It would be coming off the heels of our class learning about the medieval period and the Middle Ages, so that information would be fresh in their minds. And also, it's material that would be taught in a world history classroom, so you can think it would probably be ninth graders that would be in the class. And just so we're on the same page, the essential standard that aligns with this content is analyze the political, economic, social, and cultural factors that led to the development of the first age of global interaction. And the clarifying objective that aligns is explain how interest in classical learning and religious reform contributed to increased global interaction. For example, the Renaissance, Protestant Reformation, Catholic Reformation, and printing revolution. This lesson would be it would be a form of direct instruction with the teacher in the front of the classroom presenting a PowerPoint presentation to the students as they can take notes. But along with that, there's 3 opportunities for class discussion, and I'll point those out to you as we go. Here's one of them right here. So I would just ask the students to respond to these questions by writing in a journal notebook their responses, or typing up in a Google document. And after they type or write these responses, we would, as a class, we would talk about them. I'd give the students opportunities to share what they wrote. And when they do that, it gives me a chance as the teacher to guide them in the right direction where they might be a little bit misled. It gives a chance to affirm that they are, the students are learning what the teacher is trying to get across, and it also gives the students a chance to learn from each other. So there'll be 3 opportunities. One of them you just saw. The second one is actually going to be after a crash course video that you'll see later. I won't ask the students to write up a response to that. I would just ask them to share a few takeaways they had from the video that we just watched together. And you'll see that when we get to it. As I was converting the PowerPoint slides, a little bit of the design is not the same as I originally created it. However, the content is still all the same, so we're still all good there. I won't be able to go into as much detail as I would like. In a lot of these topics, I'm going to have to go kind of fast. So just know there's not a certain agenda I'm trying to get across by avoiding certain information or skipping over very quickly certain materials. It's all for the sake of time is why I'll be moving fast and potentially have to skip over a few things. But in the modern era that we live in today, we know that there are a lot of different branches and denominations of Christianity, and you can think of that with other religions as well. There's different sects of each of these religions. But in the Middle Ages, in Europe, that was totally not the case. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, it was dominated by the Catholic Church. However, the term Catholic would not have been used during that time period. It would just be the church, because that's all that there was before the Reformation. And another thing that's different to this time period is that politics and religion were deeply intertwined. So there was no separation of church and state that we know of today. And so as we learn about this Protestant Reformation, one person that totally stands out and you know, had a lot to do with what happened is Martin Luther. Now, normally it's not a safe thing for when you're teaching history to just focus in on what is termed big man history and just look at individuals as if they cause the total changes of history, because that's really not how history works. It's normally a lot of different elements and factors that lead to changes happening. But the Reformation is kind of a unique circumstance, especially with the start of the Reformation, because Martin Luther really had a whole lot to do that. We can really point to him as someone who had a significant impact on what happened in this situation. So he had a struggle throughout his life in a personal struggle of his assurance of salvation, which was something that was very critical and meaningful to him. He never knew if he was quite saved or not, and that's something that leads to a lot of the ideas and a lot of the teachings and doctrines that he embodies later on in his career that we'll touch on a little bit. But he had that struggle throughout his life. It becomes a big theme in his life, and he was encouraged whenever he was young to become a lawyer, and he did in fact go to law school. But one day, as he's in law school, and as he was journeying one day, he got caught up in the middle of a lightning storm. Now, this storm was so severe that Luther started to fear for his life, and it got to the point that there was a lightning strike on the ground right near where he was at, and out of fear he cried out to Saint Anne that if he was spared during the storm, that he would devote the rest of his life to God and become a monk, and that he would just dedicate himself that way. He ended up surviving the lightning storm, and he held up to his promise by becoming a monk after that. So upon becoming a monk, he starts to study the scriptures himself and starts to come up with his own interpretations on the Bible. And this leads to him, having some issues with some of the things that he saw, such as the selling of indulgences, purgatory, the authority of Scripture, some of the doctrines surrounding those, and also with consubstantiation versus transubstantiation, marriage among priests, and the 5 solas, which kind of embodies what his doctrines and theology was all about. Now, there was one point where he had a confrontation with Johann Chazil, who was selling indulgences, and this was just a popular account as Chazil was trying to convince people that he could buy their families out of purgatory and get them to heaven. And these indulgences, some scholars say that they were about a third of a person's wages, or in some studies say that even half of a person's wages. So these indulgences were very expensive, and it was just a way that people were being manipulated. And Luther had a big problem with that. He starts to speak out against it. And on October 31st, 1517, he posts the 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. And most scholars are in agreement that this is the start of the Protestant Reformation, whenever he nails those 95 Theses. Now, there are different cases of proto-Protestantism, which is just Protestants who lived before the Reformation, but the term Protestant would not have been used, but people who had the same ideas, doctrines, theology as Protestants would have later, and most of those people were declared heretics, and they had little influence. And someone we can think about that with is with John Wycliffe. He is an example of someone who had very similar views that Luther did, and did a lot of different things. But we'll talk about him just a little bit later. But right here, this is where the video would be that we would watch as a class. It's about 15 minutes, and then we'd have a little bit of discussion on that. And so these 95 Theses, as I said, they just kind of outline Luther's perspectives on the selling of indulgences and other facets of the system and structure of the church of that time. And at Luther's trial is named the Diet of Worms, or Worms, either way you can pronounce it. And at this trial, he was asked to recant his beliefs, and Luther objected to doing that, and he did not do that. He was sentenced to exile. However, he was protected by Frederick the Wise, who was the Elector of Saxony, and then after he passed away, shortly thereafter, he was protected by his son afterwards. So these 5 solas that you see here, I mentioned them just a second ago, they embody what Luther's theology was all about, some of the things and these things, they directly oppose the church and their rituals, customs, and traditions that had been held for a very long time. So this would have been, very controversial during its time. So as we look at this, as I've been telling you these things about the Reformation, what does this Reformation have to do with global interaction? So this event, it contributed to the developments of capitalism and enlightenment. It challenged the authority and power of the church and priests, And getting to both of those things, and the big point here is that the Reformation led to the creation of the individual. An important note to think about is that Luther was not the first person to try to reform the church. He was not the first person to have ideas that contradicted those of the Pope and of the church. I mentioned John Wycliffe earlier. Wycliffe did some very similar things that Luther did. He translated the Bible into English, and he lived in 1330, died in 1338. And he translated the Bible into English, and Luther did the same thing in German. So he translated the Bible just like Luther did. He had a lot of similar doctrines like that of the Eucharist and of the authority of Scripture. They shared similar ideas on those subjects, but he's never regarded as the start of the Reformation, and that is the reason for that is what made Luther different. And what made him so successful and such an earth-shaking event was his use of the printing press. The printing press was invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century, and this is arguably the most influential and earth-shaking invention in the history of the world, all the way to today. So, because of the printing press, Luther was able to distribute the 95 Theses, his tracts and other works, and also his translation of the New Testament in German. He was able to distribute that, and that's what these ideas were able to now circulate, and other people were able to read them, and that's what inspired a movement to be able to happen. So throughout the Middle Ages, the only people who were able to read the Bible and interpret it were those who could read the Latin, and the odds of someone being able to do that, the common person only knew about one person who could read the Bible. So it was very easily to be manipulated because of that. But now, people don't have to rely so much on the interpretation of the priests and the people who can read the Bible, such as Johann Tetzel, as I mentioned earlier. It's much harder for people to be manipulated now because so many others can read it as well. So the ideas of self and each person have individual rights given by God were results of the Reformation, and these ideas were able to now not only spread in Germany but across Europe. And the ideas and teachings, they can now spread much faster and across countries with the invention of Gutenberg and the blueprint of Luther as well, so they can see how he was successful and try to follow that same foundation that he did and be successful as well. And right here is our last opportunity for discussion. So these are just some questions that kind of review what we've been thinking about and tries to make the content relevant to the students where they are at today. So in your own words, how did Luther and the Reformation lead to further global interaction over time? What similarities can you think of between Martin Luther and other reformers such as Martin Luther King Jr. throughout history? And is the printing press the most significant invention of all time, the GOAT of all innovations? Does that make Johannes Gutenberg the most influential person in history? For each question, why or why not? So they can think about how the printing press relates to that of the iPhone and other new devices of certain modes of transportation. So they can just kind of debate that amongst themselves, and they can see how those things would not have been possible probably if it wasn't for the invention of the printing press in the first place. I would have loved to went in more detail on a lot of these different subjects and topics, but for time's sake, I had to keep on going. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and over and out.